of the order. He's disrupting the speech. Take my word for it that the right honourable gentleman is not going to give way.
Mr. Speaker, where the further engagement of our armed forces are concerned, it will be proper for this House to raise legitimate questions, as indeed many have in all parties, over the supply, the suitability of equipment, through to eventual war aims, British forces' participation, the kind of bombs to be used. Are we going to desist, from example, resort to cluster bombs, depleted uranium, and the longer-term role that we hope British forces, if this war ensues, will be able to play in the humanitarian cause and the reconstruction cause, where they have such a distinguished international track record. And therefore, that is why we have supported the UN route, and it is a source of great regret if this motion is passed today that British troops will be put into action. There are, however, two specific areas where I think the government are right to expect and deserve very significant credit over the course of the past 6 months. The first is that they were instrumental in helping the United States to go down, a reluctant United States, to go down the United Nations route. And everything that I have been party to and privy to over these past 6 months certainly persuades me that that is the case. And that secondly, they have been consistent as a government, Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and other senior colleagues, in emphasising to the Americans and to others the primary need to re-establish a meaningful Middle East peace process. What makes the events of the past few days— I'll just finish this point, and then of course I'll give way.
You don't give way to the person you accuse!
What makes this—
What a disgrace! You don't give way to the person you accuse!
Order, Mr. Fabricant, you must calm yourself. We need calm.
Mr. Speaker, what makes this week so sadly ironic is that the very moment at which the Bush administration at last embraced the degree of fresh urgency over the Middle East peace process was the very moment which it also chose to abandon the United Nations route. And there is a suspicion, let's face it, there is a suspicion that having taken the decision to abandon the United Nations route, the sudden embrace of the Middle East peace processes with refreshed urgency does arouse considerable concern amongst many that these two are not unconnected, and perhaps if they're willing to do one, they may be willing to abandon the other or go lukewarm at a later stage. Now, what about the— well, I'm sorry, there was one gentleman there, and then of course I'll come to you.
I am most grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. It's tempting to ask why he gives way to some and not others, but what I want to say is I want to ask him why he pays tribute, quite rightly, to the Prime Minister for engaging with the United States, and yet now he believes it's right to release them into isolationism and then make a settlement of the Middle East and progress of the Middle East peace process less likely.
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept the thesis. Now, I'll explain to the honourable gentleman exactly why. And I think it's best summed up in the words of Kofi Annan over these past few days. Because in the absence of a further explicit United Nations resolution, which is the position obviously we find ourselves in, he remarked last week, the legitimacy and support for any such action will be seriously impaired. If the USA and others go outside the Council and take military action, it will not be in conformity with the Chapter. That raises very serious questions upon which we should reflect. And only yesterday afternoon, the Secretary-General said, if the action is to take place without the support of the Council, its legitimacy will be questioned and the international support for it will be diminished. I think we are right to reflect upon these considerations from the Secretary-General. I give way to him.
The right honourable gentleman has not answered the question put by the previous speaker. Would he please, having praised the Prime Minister and the government quite correctly for the influence that they have been exerting in respect of the Middle East peace process, will he please explain how his vote tonight will contribute to maximising British influence over that peace process.
Because I think I would say to the honourable gentleman, responded to that. It is best proceeded through the auspices of the United Nations itself. And if we undermine the legitimacy and the authority of the United Nations, then that cannot be of assistance to re-establishing the Middle East peace process. And although I've never one that's been persuaded as to a causal link between... Can I just make a little bit more progress? And of course I'll give way. As to the causal link between the Iraqi regime, Al-Qaeda, and September the 11th, I do believe that the impact of war under these circumstances is bound to weaken the international coalition against terrorism itself, not least in the Muslim world. And the big fear that many of us have is that this is simply going to breed further generations of suicide bombers. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Honourable gentlemen agree with me that the reason for the failure of United Nations and diplomacy is not the potential threat from French, Germans, Russians, Chinese, and the international community, but the American administration of hawks and oil merchants who have not any reason or any intention to go through the route of peaceful resolution to this crisis.
Well, I think that there is great anxiety in this country, particularly about the more hawkish elements of the Bush administration. And I do think that if people in this country were given a choice in whom they would prefer to vest their trust, I think undoubtedly they'd go for the present Secretary General of the United Nations than they would the present President of the United States. No, I'm not giving way now. I really want to make progress. Now, last night the Foreign Secretary was saying in the House on 1441 that everybody knew what they were signing up for. But when one looks at what both the British and the American ambassadors said at the time in securing that unanimity, the British ambassador said, "Let me be equally clear in response. As a co-sponsor with the United States of the text we have just adopted, there is no automaticity in this resolution." And the American ambassador, his counterpart, went on to say, if there's a further Iraqi breach, the matter will return to the Council for discussions as required. Now, the fact of the matter is that with China and France and Russia as permanent members not acknowledging that an automatic trigger has taken place, it is clear that people agreed to 1441 on different bases. The historians will have to judge why that came about, but that is the position in which we find ourselves. And to circumvent the continuing legitimate task of the weapons inspectors who say, and who have been instructed unanimously in the name of the international community, our own countries included, that they should be given extra space, to cut that process short is going to cause all the international disorder, tension and potential chaos that we are warning against and have been from quite some time. So before launching, I'm really going to conclude, before launching an almighty assault, Mr. Speaker, upon Iraq, are we not better to pursue the course of disarmament on the ground in the presence of weapons inspectors? No matter how sophisticated modern technology, even since the last Gulf War, is it not more precise to have weapons dismantled in the presence of inspectors rather than so-called precision bombing trying to take them out? There is huge public anxiety in our country. That is the mark of a fundamentally decent society. And all of us, whatever our views, whatever our parties, know that the kind of people contacting us are very different from many of those whom we regularly deal with. The number of times you're told, "I've never contacted a member of Parliament before." The kind of people who say, "I've never been politically active before." The kind of people who've never gone on a march or attended a vigil before. And there's also something else significant about what they say to you. They actually say, whether they agree with the Prime Minister or not, only a tiny fraction ever call into question the sincerity of the Prime Minister in this matter. And I've never done so, and I don't do so today. But, much as they detest Saddam's brutality, they're not persuaded that the case has been made adequately at this point for war. They're worried about this doctrine, this new doctrine of regime change. They're wary of the motives of the Bush administration, and they do not like to see Britain separated from its natural international allies. I believe that this cross-party amendment, Mr. Speaker, is the correct amendment. It is tabled at the correct time. If passed, it would send the correct signal. And it's on those grounds that the Liberal Democrats will vote for it tonight.
Alan Howarth.